Chabra on Zoom, you hear me all right? Excellent. All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Let us begin with a beautiful daf ahead of us today. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Kislev, Sammy and Malka Esterson, for dedicating all the shiurim and drashos this month in memory of their parents, Yitzchak Leib ben Aaron HaKohen, Sarah Rachel Bas Baruch Avram and Hinda Bas Henech Ephraim. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshamas will have an aliyah and the family in a chama. We thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating the shiurim and drashos this week in memory of Paul's aunt, Esther Pollack, Esther Bas Zechariah, whose yahrzeit is on the 29th of Kislev. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah and the family in a chama. And our ongoing Daf Yomi sponsors in this Choseva Refuah Shlema for Ruchama Aviva Bas Shein Lachana and for Achal Yehudis Bas Tova Gittel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Kol Chola Yisrael will enjoy a complete and enduring refuah. And with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Chav Gimel 23. A really incredible Gemara. Today we are actually picking up on the bottom of Chav Beis and with base 22b, and we are picking up 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. So remember again, just to orient ourselves for a bit, so we're still in the same machlokes as we were yesterday. Remember again, we really got into actually I should say what we started on Shabbos. We really got into a very dramatic machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Avo. So remember again, Chizkiah telling us that the way we learn the Isser Chametz on Pesach is from the pasuk of Lo Ye'achel. In other words, had the Torah just written Lo Yochal, you can't eat Chametz, Lo Yochal would have meant literally you can't eat it. But Hana, right, benefit is absolutely permitted, which Chizkiah translates to mean it shall not come to be eaten. And Chizkiah learns from there that it shall not come to be eaten means also an Isser Hana. Don't do anything which could potentially lead to consumption in any way. So do not do something that allows it to come to be eaten. But the core idea, according to Chizkiah, is that any time the Torah just puts forward what we call a regular Isser Achila, a general prohibition of consumption, all that is an Isser Achila. In other words, halacha l'maisa, Isser Achila does not automatically include an Isser Hana. Comes along Rabbi Avo says no. Anytime the Torah says lo yochal, lo sochal, lo sochal, lo sochlu, any form of an Isser Achila, by definition, includes in trying to show where this would not seem to, one more piece. According to Rabbi Avo, unless, of course, the Torah gives you an exception. Right? If the Torah tells you that something is not an Isser Hana, then the Isser Hana doesn't apply. For example, a paradigmatic example of that was Nevela. Right? So Nevela is the perfect example where, again, the Torah explicitly says, Lager, to the Nachri, you could go ahead and give it, to sell it. And again, what we've been seeing is a number of different exceptions. That's really what's coming up. So we keep on raising kashas against Rabbi Avo, and we keep on seeing essentially exceptions to this rule. So we're continuing. And again, what's fascinating about this is along the journey, I owe you a lot of halacha l'maisa. I also owe you the lakel of tashlichun. Also, I haven't forgotten. I think I also owe you the halacha l'maisa from Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. So there's a lot. I owe you a lot. All right, Demir Hashem, I'll make good on it. So we'll see. Here we go. V'harei arla. So continuing again, we'll say in the bottom of Chav Beis and with Beis, 7 lines up from the bottom, same topic. V'harei arla. What about arla? So also remember again, arla is after you plant a fruit tree. The halach is for the first 3 years after it's been planted. Halacha l'maisa, again, you are not permitted to partake of the fruit. So the Gemara says, "V'hari arla d'rachman amar areilim lo yochal." Pasuk says by arla that he says areilim lo ye'achel. So the fruit of the first 3 years will be areilim, right? So we'll say you will not eat it. V'tanya, we learned. Areilim lo yochal, areilim lo yeachal, eimi ela isra achila. I only know that halacha l'maisi can't eat arla. Minayin shlo yena mimenu. How do I know that I shouldn't get hana from arla? Shelo yitzba bo, that you shouldn't go ahead and make dye out of it. V'lo yadli kindle my ner. We'll say, right, what an incredible tie into Chanukah as well. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Talmud Lomar, va'araltem oroso arelim lo ye'achel, l'rapos eskulam. So we'll say, therefore, the Gemara points out that the Torah uses an elongated form of areltem arloso arelim lo ye'achel. So let's remember again, so arel, we often translate that word as uncircumcised, but the truth is, arel really means shut off, cut off, set aside. That's why, again, the lashon of being an arel leiv, what does it mean, uncircumcised? Right? It means my heart is covered over, it's cut off from the Ribbon Shalom. So the Torah uses this repeated lashon of cut off, set aside, shut off, to indicate to us not only is there an Isra Achila, but there's also an Isra Hana. So we'll say, so again, the Gemara now phrases this question. Time of the Kasav Rachman of Aratam Rasa Arelim Halav Hachi, Havamine Isra Achila Mashma, Isra Hana Lo Mashma. So we'll say, see here the Kasha, the reason that there's an Isra Hana by Arla is why? Because of the repeated Lashon, Araltem, Arla, so on and on and on. Had the Torah just said, Lo Ye Achel, apparently all that would have taught me was an Isra Achila, not an Isra Hana. So we'll say it's a kasha on Rabbi Avo, because according to Rabbi Avo, ultimately, again, the lo ye'achel by itself teaches me, the lo ye'achel by itself teaches me an isser hana as well, to which the Gemara said, Olam, lo ye'achel mashra ben isra achila ben isra hana. In reality, like we said before, lo ye'achel, like Rabbi Avo said, teaches me both an isra achila and an isra hana. So why is the case of Arla different, of Arla different, sorry? V'shani hasam d'chsev lochem. Interesting, I will say, because the pasuk by Arla adds in the pasuk of lochem. It says shalosh shanim yeh lochem arelim. It says it'll be lochem, it'll be to you arelim. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, lochem shalachem yehi. So I'll say, I would have thought that based on that word lachem, it is very interesting. Lo yachel teaches me an iser achila. The Gemara says, right? But let me say it differently. The Gemara is suggesting now that lo yachel, under normal circumstances, would teach me both an isser achila and an isser hana. Okay? Fine, let's take Rabbi Avo. The reason the Gemara says this case is a bit more complicated is because the Torah adds in an extra word lachem. So because it says lachem, I might have thought that there is no isser hana when it comes to Arla. Therefore, in order to go ahead and teach us that there is an Isser Hana, the Torah uses the elongated form, Va'araltem, Arasa, Arla, over and over and over. It'll be shut off, cut off from you. Kamash Mala, no, that Allah Chalamaisa, there is an Isser Hana as well. So the Gemara says, well, one second. The Ela Hashta Diksivi Hanach Krai, Lachem Lamali. So Rabbi will say, here's the Shaila. See, if you're going to go out of your way, so I'll say, what's happening over here? It's such a fascinating drasha. Where the Gemara is holding right now is like this. Normally when it says lo yachal, what does lo yachal teach me? What does it teach me? Teaches me that there's an isser achila and an isser hana. But here's the problem. The Torah in the pasuk by Arla also says lochem, that ultimately again, that it'll be for you. So therefore, I would have thought that means that halacha l'maisa, you're permitted to have hana. So what does the Torah do to counter that? It says, "Unetatem kol itz machal va'araltem arloso, va'araltem arloso arelim." So it says essentially one form of arla 3 different times in order to therefore show you that halacha l'maisa it is asr bana. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Hashad d'chsidi hanach Christ. If that's the case, that you've gone out of your way to highlight the fact that this is asr bana. So what does the word lachem come to teach me? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you. Lechidisanya. Lachem is very interesting. L'rabos es hanatua top of chav gimel l'rabim. So both say lachem comes to include halacha l'maisa, a tree, or I should say, a tree that is planted for the rabbim. So both say, listen to this. What happens if halacha l'maisa, something is planted not for individual benefit, but for public benefit? I go ahead and I plant a tree for the use of the rabbim. Is that tree, or is the fruit of that tree subject to the halachos of Arla? So the first opinion says that halacha l'maisa lachem, which is plural, for you, plural, teaches what? That even if a tree is planted for the benefit of the rabbim, it is still subject to Arla. Rabbi Yehuda really says, lahotzi esanatul rabbim. So very interesting. Rabbi Yehuda says just the opposite. It actually comes to go ahead and exclude a tree that is planted for the rabbim. The Rabbi say the halacha is that the halachos of Arla only apply to something that is planted for an individual. Anything that is planted for the rabbim, by definition, is excluded from the halachos of Arla. So my time at the Tanakama, what's the reason that the Tanakama dichsev unetatem liyachid mashma? So the Tanakama will say unetatem. Ultimately, again, is a reference to something being planted for an individual, but does not refer to something being planted for the collective. Therefore, ultimately, again, it comes in rights lachem to exclude that which is planted for the rabbim. Rabbi Yehuda, unetatem mashma bein l'rabbim bein l'yachid. So Rabbi Yehuda says unetatem really mashma, whether it's planted for an individual or for the collective. V'lachem bein yachid bein rabbi mashma. Lachem also could mean for the individual, for the collective. Therefore, what? Havi ribui acha ribui. Supposed to say one of the exegetical principles is a ribui acha ribui, which means you have one, we'll call it inclusive statement after another inclusive statement. Vein ribui acha ribui ela lemait, and ribui acha ribui only comes to go ahead and be mamait, exclude, which therefore according to Rabbi Yehuda means that you exclude a tree that was planted for the rabbim from the halachos of Arla. So we'll say, so therefore again, remember, we're going to keep focused here because it's easy to lose ourselves in all the fascinating halacha. So remember again, we only brought up this case as a kasher Rabbi Avo. Because remember again, here, the Torah tells me about Arla lo ye'achel, I cannot eat Arla, but yet again, the Torah goes out of its way to say araltem, arlaso, Arla, teach it as an Isser Hana. But according to Rabbi Avo, lo ye'achel should be enough to teach me an Isra Achila and an Isra Hana. So obviously the Gemara brings this up as a proof against Rabbi Avo, to which the Gemara answers, not necessarily. This case is a little bit different because we have this whole lachem. Again, because lachem would normally tell you that you can have hana. What kind of hana could I have had? Potentially something planted for the public. And therefore, again, bottom line is this is not a good conclusive case to prove or to disprove Rabbi Avo's principle. Good. Next. V'harei truma. Dam Rachman. Let's listen to this. What about truma? Truma. Torah says, Dam Rachman v'chol zar lo yochal. V'chol zar lo yochal kodesh. We'll say any non-Kohen cannot partake of it, ultimately again because it's Kodesh. Utnan. So we'll say, so again, remember, anytime I see, according to Rabbi Avo, Lo Yochal, the halacha l'maaseh, that should include what? Isra Achila and Isra Hana. Remember, all of this is a kasha on Rabbi Avo. So the Gemara says, yet we learned, Utnan, Ma'ar v'lunaz Rabbi Yain l'Yisrael b'truma. You can make an Eruv. What's the incredible, good chazara. Right? You can make an Eruv. Ultimately, again, for a Nazir with wine or for a Yisrael with Truma, which Rabbi says shows you that what? Even though a Yisrael is not permitted to go ahead and eat Truma, he clearly can what? Get Hana from Truma. So this is a kasha on Rabbi Avo, because according to Rabbi Avo, the lo yochal by Truma should be an Isra Hana as well. Amra Papa Shiny Hasan the Amakra Trumas. We'll say once again, Truma is different because the pasuk says Trumaschem, your Truma. Shalachem tehei. That teaches me that what? That halacha l'maisa, it should be yours. So we'll say, so in other words, Rabbi Avo would say like this. Under normal circumstances, when the Torah says that you can't eat truma v'chol zar lo yochal, that teaches me Isra Achila and Isra Hana. But then why is it that the Yisrael is allowed to make an Eruv with truma? To which Rabbi Avo respond, because the Torah says Trumaschem. The Torah is telling you that the truma is yours in certain respects. What kind of respect? In other words, that you can get hana. What kind of hana? That you can make an eruv out of it. So I say, what would Chizkiah say? V'idach, Chizkiah would say, Trumaschem d'chol Yisrael kavan. I will say, and I remember again, according to Chizkiah, an Isra Achila does not automatically mean an Isra Hana. Right? A regular Isra Achila actually just means Achila. It's only when the Torah writes a protracted form, ultimately again of an Isra Achila, does it come to include an Isra Hana. So according to Chizkiah, what does Trumaschem come to teach me? To which it's very interesting. Idach, Chizkiah will say Trumaschem d'chol Yisrael ka'amar. But according to Chizkiah, interestingly enough, there's nothing really to be learned from Trumaschem. That's just the Torah, way the Torah is writing. Right? The Torah is just writing your Truma. a reference to the fact that the truma or the mitzvah of truma belongs to quote unquote Klal Yisrael. Okay, so we'll say, so therefore, once again, no raya against Rabbi Avo from this case. Next, Nazir. Vari Nazir Drachman Amar Mechartsonin Va'ad Zag Lo Yochal. So we'll say the pasuk says by Nazir, Lo Yachal. Lo Yochel, excuse me. So what about by Nazir? The Torah says, Mechartsonim Azag literally means from grape skins until grape seeds, the Nazir will not eat, which is just another way of saying the Nazir cannot eat any part of the grape. So Havahari Nazir Drachman Amar Mechartsonin Va'ad Zag Lo Yochel. Utnan, and we learn. So we'll say, so once again, it's a very simple progression. Current Rabbi Avo, once I see lo yocha, we'll say, what should be the halacha? Should the halacha? Isra chila, isra hana. Good. But what about Utnan? We learned ma'arv the nazir beyayin, that you can go ahead and make an eruv for a nazir with wine. So we'll say, you see from here that even though a nazir is not allowed to consume wine, he is permitted to get hana. Amar Marzutra, shani hasan da amakra nizro. We'll say, you see the pasuk says nizro, his nizirus, shelo yehe, which indicates to us that there are aspects of this nizirus, quote unquote, which belong to him, which the Gemara is interpreting to mean that there are aspects of the prohibition from which he is permitted to derive benefit. So although he can't go ahead and consume the grapes, he can get benefit from them, and that he can use them to make an eruv. Rav Ashi says, Kodesh yegedal parasa'arosho. So we'll say the pasuk says that the hair of the nazir which grows ultimately is consecrated. We learned from here, Gidulo kadosh ve'in davar achar kadosh. So the Gemara says, interestingly enough, the way we darshan it is, it's only the hair that is absolutely kadosh, i.e. precluded from any benefit, but other aspects of his nazirus are not absolutely kadosh and precluded from benefit. Therefore, halacha l'may says, much as he cannot consume grapes in any way, he is permitted to get benefit. The Gemara says, ve'midi ve'ein davar achar ksiv. Does the pasuk say that only hair and nothing else is precluded from benefit? Ella mechavarta kidei Marzutra. Rather, I will say the Gemara says the drasha of Marzutra makes a bit more sense. The fact that the Torah says nizro, so we begin to see something very interesting, a pattern over here that's developing. That even Rabbi Avo, who normally holds that what? That halacha l'maisa, whenever you see an Isra Achila also includes what? Isra Hana. When the particular prohibition adds in an additional, I will call it additional possessive phrase or word, that seems to put the davar ha'asr back into the reshus of the individual for hana'a purpose, which is a very intuitive limud. In other words, the Torah is going out of its way to include an additional possessive word. Why is that there? So Rabbi Avo is going to say to put it back. So it's almost like the Isra Achila takes it out of your domain in totality, Achila and Hana, and then the particular possessive, really extra word will put it back in some way. So we see it again. We saw that by Truma, we saw that by Arla, and now again we just saw it by Nazira. So it's really quite fascinating. I have Hari Chadash, but something about Chadash is really, really, really exciting. So many of these halachas. Hari Chadash Rachmana Amar, V'lechem v'kali v'karmel, lo sochlu ad esem hayomazeh. So we'll say the pasuk tells us Chadash. Remember again, new grain, which is anything planted since last Pesach. So the halacha is ultimately, again, only becomes permitted for consumption once you go ahead and offer up the carbon omer. So it says, lo sochlu ad esam yamazeh. So we'll say, so once again, if you're Rabbi Avo, lo sochlu means what? Lo sochlu Isra Achila and Isra Hana. But one second, but we learned, kotzer l'shaches umachila behema. Suppose that you could go ahead and, of course, should say shachas. You're permitted to go ahead and harvest shachas. We'll say shachas is premature grapes, premature grain, right? Underdeveloped grain. So Allah you could go ahead, which is very soft. You would use it for animal food, for animal feed, right? You wouldn't eat it yourself, but Allah you could go ahead and harvest the soft, immature grain, and you could give it to your animal. So we'll see again, once again, you see from here an Isra Achila by Chadash. Isra Achila normally, I assume, means that Isra Achila and Isra Hana. And now halacha l'maisa, the Torah tells me, or the Gemara tells me, that I can get Hana. Amar of Shmaya, Shiny Hasan, the Amakra, Kitzir Chem. We'll say once again, same pattern. The Torah says, it shall be your harvest. Ketzirchem shalachem yehi. So in certain respects, ultimately, again, as much as there is an Isser Achila, the Torah gives back the produce to you. In what way? Although you're not permitted to eat it, you are permitted to go ahead and get some level of benefit from it. So we'll say, same pattern. The Isra Achila, according to Rabbi Yaval, will remove it from your domain, both for Isra Achila and Isra Hana. But then when you find this additional possessive word, it'll put it back in your rishus for some type of Hana. So Gemara says, V'idach, so remember again, Abba say Chizkiah doesn't have to go through these gymnastics, right? Remember again, Abba say it's only Rabbi Avo, because according to Rabbi Avo, every Isra Achila removes the item from you for both again Achila and Hana. But yet then when you see a brayso that says Ramishna that says that you can get Hana, Rabbi Avo has to go through this whole limud that there's a possessive word that puts it back in your just according to Chizkiah, Abba say you don't have to go through all this because according to Chizkiah, an Isra Achila just means what? An Isra Achila. That's it. So what about Kitzirchem? That's just the way the Torah talks. Kitzirchem, Torah is talking to us because this is a mitzvah regarding our harvest. Next. So it's interesting if the pasuk says by shratzim, the prohibition to consume creepy, crawly things. So what do I do with this? So the Gemara says, now we learned supposed to listen to this. Those who go ahead, trappers, right? Those who go ahead are hunters. Those who hunt chaya, ofos, and dagim, which literally means again non-domesticated animals, birds and fish. This is an interesting case. Let's say you're a trapper. You put down some traps, and inside of your traps are non-kosher animals, right? Meaning to mean. So what's the halacha? Mutarin lemochron lenachrim. You are permitted to sell these non-kosher animals, ultimately again, to non-Jews. Now, I will say, now remember again, according to Rabbi Avo, this is a kasha. Why? Because when the Torah speaks about the prohibition to eat, in this case it's shratzim, but it's really all non-kosher animals, the Torah phrases it as an Isra Achila, which according to Rabbi Avo should mean what? An Isra Achila and an Isra Hana. Yet the Brayse clearly, or the Mishnah is clearly telling me that halacha lamaisa, I could sell non-kosher animals to a non-Jew. Shiny Hasan Damakra Lachem Shalachem Yehe. We'll say so again, once again, same drasha. Rabbi Abba says, no. There's an additional possessive word, lachem. It'll be for you. And therefore, again, the Torah is giving it back to you in some way, namely that halacha l'mais you are permitted to go ahead and sell it to a nachri. Ihachi afilu lechatchila. Now, we're supposed to. This is very interesting. If that's the case, then halacha l'maisa. Why can't I just proactively trap non-kosher animals, non-kosher shratzim, to sell it to non-Jews? To which the Gemara says, "Shiny hacha damakra yehu b'hav yasan yehu." The pasuk ultimately says yihiyu by non-kosher animals yihiyu. So therefore, again, I will say the yihiyu means it remains in its unkosher, unclean status, and therefore one should have some level of distance from it. So I will say this happens to be an interesting discussion because the Gemara seems to indicate over here that a Jew would not be permitted to do sustained business with non-kosher food, which is actually a very interesting discussion in halacha in general. In other words, I know that obviously a Jew can't do any kind of business with basar b'chalov, right? Because any mixture of milk and meat together is not only prohibited for consumption, but it is also prohibited for benefit. What about a Jew actively engaging in commerce of non-kosher food? So we'll say, interesting enough, the way the Mishnah kind of had its case was, I have traps. My intention is to go ahead and catch kosher food, and halacha l'maisa, my traps just, non-kosher animals wander into my traps. So once they're already there, I could sell it off. But the Gemara seems to indicate that halacha l'maisa, a Jew could not proactively engage in commerce with non-kosher animals, or non-kosher food items. So again, it's a much bigger discussion halacha, but just interesting to see that seems to be the conclusion over here. L'chizkiah, lameli l'michtav, lo ye'achel, u'maisi lachem l'mishrei. So what's according to Chizkiah, why does the Torah have to say lo ye'achel by shratzim, and then write lachem to be matred b'hana? Lo lichtel rachmar lo ye'achel v'lo bai lachem. Also remember, according to Chizkiah, just don't write lo ye'achel. In other words, just write lo yochal. Don't write the longer protracted form, right? Don't write the elongated form. Just write the shorter form, which by definition just means an Isra Achila, and then you don't, not Hana, then you don't need Lachem to put it back into your Rishus, ultimately again for Hana. To which Amlecha Chizkiah, Taima didi nam mihacha. Chizkiah says, in fact, it's funny you should bring this up because halacha lamaisa, this is one of the sources from which I derive my particular shita. So we'll say this is actually quite interesting. So ultimately, again, what the Gemara seems to be indicating to us is that halacha lamaisa, Chizkiah will learn out his particular shita from two places. Number one, ultimately, again, from chametz, and number two, from shratzim. That in both of these cases, what you see is an elongated form of lo ye'achel, right? Instead of just saying lo yochal. So interestingly enough, by sheretz, the Torah goes ahead and says lo ye'achel, and then says lachem, to put it back into your reshus for hana. Chizkiah says, why does the Torah do that? Well, that must be because although lo yochal only represents an isra achila, an elongated form like lo ye'achel represents isra achila and isra hana. Therefore, the Torah needs to put it back into your rishus with lachem by hana. Now, of course, by chametz, what happens according to Chizkiah? By chametz, the Torah never has a lachem. Therefore, what? It's the lo ye'achel tells me an isra achila and an isra hana, and never puts it back in my rishus to be matir the isra hana. So Chizkiah is just saying, by the way, this happens to be one of my sources. One of the sources for my particular position. Good. V'hari chametz, rachman lo ye'achel chametz. We'll say chametz, coming full circle now. By chametz sources lo ye'achel. V'sanyon we learned Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer. Tama al atzmecha. We'll say, listen to this. This is pretty wild. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says, you should wonder to yourself, Heich chametz aser bana kol shiva. Why is chametz aser bana all 7 days? Which the Gemara says. So we'll say, take a look at Rashi. Actually, look at Rashi. Heich chametz heich nesra chametz bana. The surely mutter bana kol shiva. So Rabbi say we're actually going to see the sheet. Rabbi Yossi Elili holds that chametz is only aser ba'achila, is not aser bana. Which is pretty dramatic. So Rabbi Yossi Elili says, how could it be that chametz is aser ba'ana? To which the Gemara says, shiny hasam da amakra lo yira lechasar shalcha yehe. So we'll say ultimately again, chametz is going to be different. Why? Because the Torah says lo yira lechasar, which indicates to us that halacha l'maisa, according to Rabbi Yossi Elili, chametz is even yours over the course of Pesach, i.e., it's not aser ba'ana. The Rabbanon will go ahead and darshan. No, shalcha yataroa aval ataro shalachirim. V'shal gavoa. So Rabbanon will say, shalcha teaches me that halacha l'maisa, I can't see my own chametz, but there's no prohibition on seeing the chametz of others, right? Whether it's a non-Jew, whether it's the Beis Hamikdash, v'idach, for that matter, even on other Jews. V'idach trei lecha ksivi. And the other opinion will say, Rabbi Yossi will say, well, there are two lechas. V'idach. And the Rabbana will say, we had this earlier. One is referring to the chametz of a nachri, who I control, and one is referring to the nachri that I don't control. But either way, chametz owned by a nachri, whether I have some level of dominion over that nachri or not, I am not responsible, nor do I violate Pesach because of that chametz. V'idach, tlos lecha ksivi. The Rabbi Yossi will say, well, there are three lechas that are in v'idach, chad b'sar v'chad b'chametz. And the Rabbana will say that it's true, but one chametz is necessary to teach me sa'ar, and one is necessary to teaching chametz. We'll also get into this sugya, but remember, interestingly enough, the prohibition of chametz does not only devolve upon edible chametz, but it even devolves on what's called sa'ar. We'll say, for lack of a better term, sa'ar is called sourdough, any other leavening agent. Whereas the leavening agent itself might not be consumable, might not be fit for consumption. Ultimately, again, because it has the power to make something else chametz, therefore it'll be aser. Leima ketenai. So we'll say, let's take a step back. And let's say maybe this whole thing is a machlokes tanam. We'll say maybe this idea that Rabbi Avo put forward, that any time you see an isra achila always includes an isra hana. So maybe this entire thing is a machlokes tanam. Here we go. So the pasuk says, "Ye'asa l'chol malacha." This is by chelev. Right? So the pasuk says, "Ye'asa." So the pasuk is Dabra b'nei Yisrael v'leimar kol chelev shar v'kesev va'ezlo. So chelu v'chelev nevelev v'chelev treifa ye'aseh l'chol melacha. So Torah tells us that chelev can be used. Ye'aseh l'chol melacha. Not tamalar l'chol melacha. What does this mean when it says chelev can be used? Right? Forbidden fat can be used ultimately again l'chol melacha. Shiyachol l'melechas kavo ye'motu l'melechas hadot ye'aser. You might have thought that chelev can only be used for, let's say, temple purposes. But for mundane individual purposes, it can't be used. Talmud Lomar L'chol Malacha Rabbi Yosef Lili. Therefore, Rabbi Yosef Lili says, L'chol Malacha teaches me that halacha l'maisa, again, I could even use chaylev for my own mundane purposes. There is no Isser Hana. Rabbi Akiva says no. Shiyachol l'malachas hadyot yehitar. L'malachas kavah yehitar. Rabbi Akiva says no. It's not a din ultimately again in Hana. It's a din in Tumah and Tara. Rabbi Akiva says you might have thought that when using chaylev l'malachas hadyot for some type of mundane purpose, it'll be tar. But for malachas kavah it'll be tamei. Talmud lomar l'chol malacha. Rabbi Yosef Lili. I don't need the pasuk teaching regarding Tumah and Tara. Where do I need the pasuk for? Le'isr u'leheter, to teach me prohibition and permission, ultimately again for general hana. But Rabbi Akiva, isr v'heter lo tzarich kra, ki itzrich kala Tumah Tara. Rabbi Akiva will say, I don't need a pasuk ultimately again for isr and heter. Rather, I need a pasuk for Tumah and Tara. Both say, what are they arguing about? Amud Beis. My lav b'hakamiflagi. Are they not arguing about the following point? The Rabbi Yosef Lili Savar. Rabbi Yosef Lili holds that in general, lo sochelu mashma ben isra achila ben isra hana. So Rabbi Yosef Lili will say like this: in general, lo sochelu refers to an isra achila and an isra hana. Therefore, v'chi asa kra l'mishrei l'nevela ba'ana hudasa. Therefore, we'll say ultimately again when the Torah comes to permit nevela, because you also remember again, nevela is the paradigmatic example of something that has an isra achila, but that is explicitly permitted by hana. Right, remember again, that's what we started all of this with. Because remember, by nevela, the Torah says I can't eat it, but it says what? Leger asher b'sharecha titneno or machar l'nachri. So I can either give it to the ger or sell it to the nachri. So watch this. So the Gemara says, "V'chi asakra l'mishrei l'nevela." When the Torah comes, so in general, so when the pasuk says lo sochelu means isra achila, isra hana. And when the Torah comes to permit hana by nevela, when the Torah comes to permit something by nevela, bana huda asa. Rabbi Akiva says no. Isra achila mashma, isra hana lo mash. Rabbi Akiva says no. In general, when the Torah goes ahead and says lo sochelu, right, then isra achila means just that, an isra achila, and not automatically an isra hana. V'chi asakra. I will say, interesting enough, it's changed over here, right? I should really go back. The Hagos Tziyunim changes nevela ultimately again to chaylev, because the truth is we'll get back to nevela in just a moment. But really, the way to read it is Rabbi Yosef Lili holds that lo sochelu ultimately. So let me read that again. Lo sochelu, we'll say means bein isra achila, bein isra hana. So right, that's Rabbi Yosef Lili. Anytime you say isra achila, it comes to include both hana and achila. And when the Torah comes to permit something, change nevela to chaylev, bahana hudasa is coming to permit it by hana. Rabbi Akiva will say, Rabbi Akiva savar isra achila mashma, isra hana lo mashma. Rabbi Akiva will say no. Anytime you see an isra achila, Rabosai, isra achila means what? Dafka that an isra achila, not an isra hana. Therefore, v'chi asakra. Therefore, when the pasuk comes to permit something, l'tumah v'tayra, it comes to teaching halakha regarding tumah and tayra, not regarding hana. So we'll say, so the Gemara is suggesting that in reality, the machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Avo is in fact a machlokes Tanoim, Rabbi Yossi Haglili and Rabbi Akiva. Namely, halacha l'maisa, when the Torah comes along and speaks about Isra Achila, does Isra Achila only mean Isra Achila, or does it come to include Isra Hana as well? To which the Gemara says, lo, incorrect. The Chuli Alma, lo sochelu mashma bein Isra Achila bein Isra Hana. In reality, the Gemara suggests everyone agrees that lo sochelu always refers to an Isra Achila and Isra Hana, which is actually quite dramatic. What the Gemara is suggesting right here is that pretty much everybody agrees with what Rabbi Avo said. That any time you have an Isra Achila, the automatic default is Isra Achila means Isra Achila and Isra Hana. That's the automatic default. V'hacha b'hakamifli. So we'll say what's happening over here by Chaylev. What's the machlokes? Watch this. Rabbi Yosef Lili Savar Kisha Hutra Nevela Hi Hutra Chelba V'gida Lo Hutra. So we'll say watch this. Rabbi Yosef Lili says like this. When nevela, let's remember again. See, here's what we go with. Everyone, according to where the Gemara is holding right now, Everyone agrees with the Shita as espoused by Rabbi Avo. Now, I remember, I just want to point out chronologically, Rabbi Avo lived after Rabbi Yossi Lili and Rabbi Akiva. Okay, just to be clear. So when we say everyone holds like Rabbi Avo, that's not, you understand, I'm not saying it literally. I'm saying everybody holds like the Shita of Rabbi Avo. So the Gemara is suggesting, follow this. The Gemara is suggesting is everyone agrees that whenever there is an Isra Achila automatically includes Achila and Hana. Okay, that's Aleph. Now, we'll say, remember again, everyone agrees also the paradigmatic example of an Isra Achila that doesn't carry an Isra Hana is what case? Nevela. Now, we'll say, no one argues on that for one simple reason, which is the Torah says it explicitly. Or again, it's a pasuk. It's not a drasha. It's a pasuk. So therefore, I will say, see, here's what I have. I have Isra Achila by itself. Normally, it's Isra Achila, Isra Hana. Torah permits nevela bahana. Watch this. Now the machlokes is going to be the scope or the parameters of the Isra Hana by nevela. This is great. Rabbi Yosef Lili Savar Kisha Hutra nevela He Hutra Chelba Vegida Lo Hutru. Both listen to this. Rabbi Yosef will say like this: when the Torah permits nevela bahana, the Torah only permits the actual meat of the nevela bahana, or the hide as well. What doesn't it include? The chelev and the gid hanasha. Chelev and gid hanasha are not automatically included in the heter hana of nevela. Therefore, v'chi itzrich kra. Therefore, we'll say the pasuk that we just quoted over here. Remember again on the bottom of Amud Aleph, where the pasuk says, chelev nevela chelev treifa ye'aseh l'chol malacha. So in the Torah it says ye'aseh l'chol malacha, that you could do whatever you want ultimately again with chelev. What is that coming to teach me? So the Gemara says v'chi itzrich kra leheter hana. So therefore, the pasuk going to teach you that chelev is mutar ba'ana huda asa. So what says according to Lili, all that the heter hana by nevela teaches me is I can get hana from the nevela itself, which means the meat of the nevela, the hide of the nevela. What doesn't it include? It doesn't include chelev and it doesn't include gid. So I'll say, remember again, this goes back to say, why doesn't it include gid? Because Rabbi Yossi Lili will say what? Like you saw yesterday's daf, ein begidin beno sein tam. Right, the gid hanash itself is not considered meat, and therefore Allah again, it's not considered under the heter hana, or it's not included under the heter hana of the nevela itself. And chelev is just reckoned separately. But I have another pasuk that comes along and says, by the way, chelev is also mutar ba'ana. Watch this. Rabbi Akiva holds kishahutra nevela. When the Torah permits hana by nevela, what happens? The Gemara says chelba v'gida nami hutru. Ultimately, we'll say, no. When the Torah says that you can get hana from an avela, we'll say, what does that include? What does it include? It includes everything. Everything. Every part. And Rabbi Akiva will say, come on, once the Torah tells me that I can get hana from the nevela, that includes every part of the nevela, which includes the meat, the hide, the chelev, as well as the gid. And therefore, v'chi itzrich kra. And therefore, when the pasuk permits something, legabe chelev, it's actually coming to permit it in the realm of tuma and tara. So the Gemara Rabbi Yosef the Ashkech. So I just want to point out, just watch the evolution of thinking. Well, we started this saying that the Machlokes Rabbi Avo and Chizkiah is really Machlokes Tanoim Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Akiva. Where the Gemara's thinking is at right now is that no halacha lemaisa. In fact, that's not the case. Halacha lemaisa. Everyone agrees that an Isser Achila automatically includes Isser Hana. That's where the Gemara is holding right now. Rabbi Yosef Lili Ashkechon Chelev the Shari Rachmana Ba'ano. According to Yosef Lili, I have now a pasuk that teaches me that Chelev is mutar ba'ano. Elagid Nema da Aser. So ultimately, what about Gid Hanosha? Also going back to yesterday's daf, it would appear that Gid Hanosha should be Aser ba'ano. Ibai Sima Hachanami da Aser. So okay, one possibility is according to Rabbi Yosef Lili, Gid Hanosha would be Aser ba'ano. Ibai Sima. The other possibility is that you can learn out that Gid Hanosha is permitted bahana from a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Uma chelev sha'anush kares mutar ba'ana. If chelev, which is punishable by kares, ultimately again is mutar ba'ana, gid she'eno anush kares l'kol shekein. Supposed to listen to this. So if chelev, which if you consume it is punishable with kares, yet it's mutar ba'ana, Gid Hanosha, which is not punishable by kares, should ultimately be permitted by Anah as well. For Rabbi Shimon, who says that Gid Hanosha is also by Anah, he would say, You can ask a pircha. You can ask a kasha on that kal v'chomer. What's the kasha on the kal v'chomer? Ma lechiliv shekin hoter michlalo etzel chaya. Let's remember again, chaylev, as much as it's punishable by karis, doesn't apply in all cases. Interesting, chaylev only applies by behema. Chaylev does not apply by non-domesticated animals, by chaya. Tomar begid shelo hoter michlalo. Yet gid hanash is usher in everything. So the Gemara says, I'm sorry. Tomar begid shelo hoter michlalo etzel chaya. V'idach, the other opinion will say, behema kamrinon, behema mias lo ishtri. Other opinion will say, don't compare behema to chaya, but rather again just look at behema. Fine. So michdi. So we'll say, so now let's get to the bottom of this already, because this is really like, we'll say this. You have to understand this particular machlokes, this particular issue. It has such, you could see, look at all the cases that we're bringing. There are so many isuri achila, and trying to figure out, does an isur achila just mean isur achila or isur hana? It's a mamish. So Gemara says, okay, so now let's get to trying to get to the bottom of this. So michdi, svinu kol hanikrai, vishaninu, chizkei Rabbi my plea. You're supposed to say, here's what's interesting. So we've gone through all of these cases. Now the nice part is we've also resolved all of these cases. And I was say, so what we've shown is how each of these cases that we brought up as a kasha according to Chizki, according to Rabbi Avo, we were able to answer doesn't really pose a kasha to Rabbi Avo. So the Gemara says, Michti, let's say, Osvinu kohani kroi, we brought up all of these psukim, vishaninu, and we went ahead and we resolved them. In other words, we answered them. So the Gemara says, Chizke Rabbi Avo, but my pligi. So we'll say, wherein lies the core contention, the core machlokes between Chizkiah and Rabbi Avo? To which the Gemara says, look at Rashi, but my pligi, the inlucha isuri hana, bedavar shene'emar bo lav bachila. So shlo ne'emar bo prat lahatir, ela hanach shnei devarim dichsiv bohen lo ye'achel, kigon shar niskav chametz Pesach. So watch this. So where does the machlokes? Where is the core case of machlokes between Rabbi Avo and Chizkiah? To which the Gemara says, I'll tell you, bechametz bepesach v'aliba d'Rabbanan. So we'll say it comes up by chametz bepesach according to the Rabbanan, and b'shar haniskal v'aliba d'divrei hakol. In the case of shar haniskal, according to Evan, we'll say, look at Rashi, v'aliba d'Rabbanan. Rashi says, so we'll say, so now watch this. The two core machlokes cases ultimately again will be where chametz Pesach and shor haniskal. We'll say, now remember, shor haniskal we had in yesterday's daf, right? We had the whole discussion about what happens if you go out and you shecht the shor haniskal after the verdict. So again, let's see. So here we go. Chizkiah, nafik lei. So Chizkiah learns out ultimately again from Lo Ye'achel. So we'll say Chizkiah learns out the Isser Hana'ah by Chametz from Lo Ye'achel. We'll say, because remember again, according to Chizkiah, normally Isser Achila carries with it what? What type of Isser? Just Achila. Just Achila, right? Good, no, right. By Chametz, it's going to be different because the Torah writes the Isser Achila in a more prolonged form. So correct. By Chametz, Chizkiah will say the Isra Achila also includes an Isra Hana because of Lo Yachel. For Rabbi Avo, Nafik Le Minevela. And interestingly enough, ultimately again, Rabbi Avo will learn it out ultimately again from the Nevela. We'll say, now what does that mean? Rabbi Avo learns out the Isra Hana of Chametz by Nevela. We'll say what that means is, Rabbi Avo says as follows. The fact that the Torah has to tell you that after telling you that Nevela is Asr Ba'achila, that it's Mutter Ba'ana, tells you that what? Under any other circumstance, an Isser Achila also conveys an Isser Hana. So we'll say, so watch this. So therefore the Gemara says, according to Chizkiah, I want to be clear, Chizkiah and Rabbi Avo both agree that Chametz is Asr Ba'ana. What they disagree is how? Is what? On how to learn it out. So interesting, Rabbi Chizkiah learns out from Lo Ye'achel. Chametz should not come to be eaten. Prolonged form teaches me again Isser Hana. Rabbi Avo learns out, listen to this, the Isser Hana of Chametz from Nevela. What? Since the Torah has to tell me that Nevela is Mutter Ba'ana, after it told me that it's Asr Ba'achila, tells me that any other case of an unqualified Isra Achila, by definition means an Isra Hana as well. So the Gemara says, Michti, Bein Lamara, Asrun Ba'ana. But again, fine. That's okay. I didn't say they have differently mudim, but the good news is, no matter what, ultimately, again, halacha lemaisa, it's going to be asr b'ana by both of them. To which the Gemara says, Ika benayu, my benayu. What's the practical difference between them? Ika benayu b'chulin shenishchetu ba'azara. Both say the case, the nafkamina case would be unconsecrated meat or unconsecrated animal that's shechted inside of the confines of the Beis Hamikdash. Chizkiah savar. Chizkiah will say as follows: that when the Torah says lo ye'achel lemeute hani, it comes to exclude these cases. Let me finish this up. Lemeute hani comes to include these cases. Chametz Pesach and Shar Niskal. Oso lemeute chulin shnishchetu ba'azara, and oso comes to include chulin shnishchetu ba'azara. That ultimately, again, it should be mutter ba'ana, as there should be asr ba'ana as well. Rabbi Avo savra oso lemeute hani. Rabbi Avo says that oso comes to exclude these cases, i.e. Chametz Pesach and Shar Niskal. Chulin shnishchetu ba'azara lav daraisi. But chulin shnishchetu ba'azara does not need a limud. Why? Because its prohibition is not daraisi. So we'll have to apologize. We did that last part quickly. We'll chazir that again in Hashem tomorrow. But I will say, but suffice it to say, we're beginning to drill down a little bit. We're trying to figure out halacha lemaisa again. What is the core point of contention in this machlokas? Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Yosef, Hashem tomorrow. We will get to resolution on this. Shkach Abosai.